Now, when you look at competitiveness, there are a number of pillars. So let me first describe that a little bit, because competitiveness is kind of defined by the cross between quality, price, and timeliness to market. And so in order to get there, you have like foundation factors of competitiveness. And roughly, people talk about 5 foundation factors. And I want here to put 5 and maybe an extra one. The first one, and they are not in any kind of order, of course, you have the regulatory and the tax environment. And here is all this investment climate about what are the rules and regulation? How much does it cost to do things? How much do you have to pay to be there? What are the services you get for that? And the regulatory and tax environment is key because you might have a lot of barriers. We call them product market regulations, barriers that pertain to specific markets. If you're talking, for instance, in India about the retail market and how retail market was for a long time close to, or automotive market there was close to foreign productions, these are regulatory barriers. So you also have things about the tax regime and how the tax regime gives incentives or not for people to be there. A lot of regulation about licensing, about land concessions. I mean, we could go forever on what is the regulatory environment and what are the tax and trade issues there. But that's definitely one bucket that's one of the foundation factors of competitiveness. Second, of course, is the infrastructure. Infrastructure is key. You want to have a factory, you need to have a road with trucks that can go on the road, you need to have water coming in, you need to have some kind of stability in power, and whether the electricity comes from the grid or it comes from generators, but then you need to put fuel in those generators. You need to have a way to evacuate waste and treat waste. You need to have a way to evacuate water and eventually treat water. A lot of things about the infrastructure. And the infrastructure is not only just for you around your factory, but it's also for the people that are working in the factory, for the people who are providing the strengths behind and the know-how behind that endeavor that is being developed. Those people need an infrastructure around them to be able to live, to feed themselves, to be secure, and to have the means to communicate and so on. So infrastructure is a very important factor of competitiveness, and a lot of investment is often done first and foremost in infrastructure to give one of the foundation. Another foundation factor is the access to finance, because without financing, companies cannot grow. Companies to grow needs to be able to have they have a plan to produce more or to do something new. They go to the bank, they borrow, they take that money, they can invest, they can make their money back, pay the bank back and borrow again, and that's how the economies develop and that's how things grow. But a lot of locations don't have good means to access financing because the banking network is not very well developed, because one cannot borrow by using movable assets as collateral, for instance. So you cannot use your stock as collateral because the systems are not very well developed, or you do not access financing because the leasing laws are not really enabled in the country, so there is more rigid ways only to get to different kind of financing. The insurance market might not be very developed, and you might need a different type of insurance to go into that market. So the access to finance that needs to be solved through financial market infrastructure, financial systems, also talking about financial inclusions, because finance needs to be available not only to the big players in that supply chain, but also to the people at the lower tiers, up to sometimes the informal sector through microfinance, so that people can do technology upgradings and eventually produce things of enough quality or service of enough quality that they can be integrated into supply chains that need this kind of quality for them to be able to be exported. Of course, Another foundation factor of competitiveness is the skills and the labor. The quality of skills and labor you can get into a country is very important. And this is not an easy thing to solve because we're talking about everything from primary education to secondary, tertiary education, where people can develop those skills. And in order to develop those high-level skills, you need a base on which to develop those, which is a general skilled workforce. And there is a lot of partnership that can be done between the public and the private sector to help those skills development. But you need also an investment into that early on, and that constitutes one of the endowment of a country or a location. And the cost of labor, of course, is very important because the lower cost of labor can be more competitive sometimes, but a more skilled labor can also be more competitive. So it's somewhere in that spectrum, depending on the industry where one is located. If the industry is based on cost or is based on quality, skills, engineering, for instance, it depends. And related to that, the last foundation factor is the access to new technologies and research and development and the use of communication and so on. Is there a way for that sector to develop new technologies, to be on the edge, to research and be one step ahead of others? And if it has a new idea, do they have enough technology to actually implement those new ideas? And this is also something which is a foundation factor to competitiveness, and it doesn't happen overnight, and it happens very often with state-sponsored programs, but those have to match very much the private sector demand. And what the difficulty is that it has to match the private sector demand of tomorrow, not the private sector demand of today, because the private sector demand of today is already being passed on by other people who are doing something better in a different country. So it's a difficulty for countries to identify what are the next sectors that are going to develop and how to improve those foundation factors so that they can increase quality, price, and timeliness. There are also, of course, external factors that are key to competitiveness. That might be a trade agreement, that can be marketing abilities, that can be specific things that belong to that country that you cannot find anywhere else. And you have those kind of 6 pillars, which is those external factors that you can bring in. Of course, like war and conflict can be one external factor that will have a huge impediment on competitiveness, regardless of all the other factors. And so one has to consider all this row of foundational factors of competitiveness or pillars of competitiveness. What do we mean? How does that translate in real life? This is an example from the Catalonia study I was telling you before, where actually it's not from that study, but we found about it when we were looking for that study. In Italy, there is a ceramic tile cluster, and it's a very well-known cluster, the Sassuolo cluster, and it's doing 30% of the world production and 60% of the world exports of that type of ceramic. It's a specific type of ceramic. And if you look at the infrastructure, there is just one little bridge going there. So infrastructure is key. If you wanted to develop this, you need just opening it to more roads and so on will be something that one will want to do and invest into. Here is a case from the Mediterranean study and the Catalonia study that we did on the cruise business in Barcelona. Barcelona is a very interesting story in terms of cruise ships, because today is the second biggest cruise terminal of the world. 15 years ago, it was nowhere to be found on the map. In the 1990s, what you see on the left picture is the infrastructure you had for the entire cruise industry in Barcelona. It was a tent on the dock that could welcome the citizens that were, the foreign citizens that were on the cruise ship, or that was going in the cruise ship from the airport. And it was like a kind of custom office and everything. In 2010, you have 7 full terminals where many cruise ships are now located. And this tremendous development has translated into an enormous amount of investments. The little graph you see at the bottom is the number of passengers. It went from quasi nothing to, I think, about 2.5 million passengers per year now. And this was done because of competitiveness action to improve the foundation factors you have for this particular industry. The regulatory environment was modified, the skills and labor was trained to perform this kind of work. The infrastructure investments were done by coordination between the city, the private sector, the region, and the state to build those terminals. There were financing that was made available. There were research and development funds that were and technology that was used. And behind all that was a public-private dialogue initiative with a business association trying to drive the entire process. Now, I gave you 5 competitiveness pillars, but now I want you to consider 3 categories of action. 3 categories of action. Because when you have a public-private dialogue that's focused on sector, this dialogue process can do many different things. First, you can have fully public actions, meaning that you have a public-private dialogue process, but what it might recommend might be things that are fully public in a way, that they have to be implemented because they're industry-specific policy and regulation, specialized tax regime, incentives regime, industrial land programs, institutional streamlining and coordination, things that need to have to be done only by the public sector. On the other hand, things could be completely private. You might have a public and the private sector discussing but deciding on actions which the private sector only has to implement in a cluster fashion. Joint procurement platform between providers in the cluster to increase local content. Joint standard setting. Private sector-led certification for increasing standard and quality. Joint investments into some of the infrastructure, joint promotion projects, feasibility projects, joint training, venture capital, research centers, and so on. This can be all privately driven. And they might come out as outcomes of public-private dialogue but these are private things to do. And the third one, of course, is between the public and private. They are the public-private actions. They are those actions that involve a little bit of both. First and foremost, PPPs, public-private partnerships, different from public-private dialogue. Public-private partnerships are programs whereas the public sector co-invest with the private sector for the private sector to deliver specific services to the public or build a number of things and maintain those which are usually the purview of the state. So you can have public partnerships to develop roads, to develop airports, and so on and so forth. And those extend even to the education sectors and many things. Hospitals, prisons can be run in a public-private partnership fashion. So often the idea is that the service delivery is a bit stronger if it's managed by the private sector, but many people might disagree with that. It depends on the political system we're in. It depends on the context and the situation. Investment promotion might be done jointly between the public and the private sector, between the investment promotion agency and some of the main players that are willing to attract foreign investment and ready to do so. Skills partnership between academia and private sector are some kind of public-private actions where, for instance, a private sector group will come in, approach academia and say, look, if you guys create a program that's like a 2 or 3 year programs, and if we have an input into the curriculum, we then commit to eventually take some of those graduates and use them as interns in our company, so it's more or less, more stronger chance to get employment, and those kind of partnerships are very pervasive nowadays. You can have last mile utility provisions where the state will, or the public authorities, the municipality also, will put infrastructure up to a point, but the last mile utility provisions will be invested into by the private sector. If we put a factory out there, can you bring the grid up to here? We'll do the last mile. This is public-private action. Innovation partnerships, so on and so forth, joint financing, insurance schemes. There is a lot that can be talked about in terms of joint action. Now, what if you took these two things I told you about, the 5 foundation factors and the 3 types of actions, and you were to put them into a matrix? You will have the real basis of a sector-specific public-private dialogue, which is the industry-level collaborative action matrix. Because it's in that matrix that you're going to be able to write down what's missing today for the sector to develop and what are the actions that we need to do. And by using a system like this, it becomes pretty easy to identify. Of course, it's not as easy as I speak it, but it's at least more clear as to how you identify issues, where you put them, who will be responsible for them, and then you can apply all the techniques of public-private dialogue that we've talked about in other sessions in this video course.